A very good day to all our viewers and welcome to another webinar of our Fair AI's Thought Leader Speak series. We have with us today Dr. Sabrina Martin. She is consultant and program lead at Oxford Insights and fellow at Oxford University. Welcome to the show, Sabrina.
Thank you very much for having me.
So first of all, tell us about what got you excited about AI ethics.
That's such an interesting question. The AI is such a rapidly developing sector of the economy. And so responsible governance of that sector is just so important. I'm a political philosopher by training, and I wanted to do political philosophy to make an impact on the world, to make a difference. But I soon discovered that politicians don't love listening to philosophers all the time. So one of the really exciting things about AI ethics is actually this is one really important area where policy and philosophy meet and have to speak to each other, just because of how quickly things are changing and developing. So I think it's really exciting as a philosopher to be able to have an impact on policy. And the nature of technology means that there's always a new challenge to face. So that's quite interesting and exciting as well.
Excellent. So in terms of projects that are involved in, especially in context to AI deployment in the government, is there anything you would like to elaborate on that?
Sure. One of my favorite projects that I've worked on, and one of the most important, I think, was with Oxford Insights when we worked with Intel to work with governments in Poland, South Korea, and India to promote an AI for youth educational program in state schools. A lot of the schools that this program was in were underserved, so these kids in secondary education felt really lucky to participate in this type of program that gave them such important skills for the future. And it was so cool to get to work with kids who influence policymakers and show them the value of this type of education and really preparing their students and traits for the future work. And I'm really passionate, obviously, as an educator about education. So that felt like really important work. Should I tell you about some more?
Yeah, so in terms of you're engaging with UK government, or is it like at the local city councils? How does it work?
Yeah, so I have worked with 3 local authorities across the UK, working with interviewing staff who manage data to find out how they think of data ethics to build the framework tailored to local needs. I think a lot of times ethics frameworks that come out from the government are either quite general, or a lot of times they're built for corporate use. But local governments have their own challenges and responsibilities to their citizens. So I think it's really important to make sure that the people closest to the citizen needs are trained properly around tech and data ethics.
Okay. So for our viewers, please could you briefly explain the ethical theories of utilitarianism, deontology, and virtue that you have worked on in your papers, in which you mentioned about ethics in AI, probably from the more practical aspect rather than the theoretical aspects. So in terms of the practical implementation of these 3 elements.
Great. So utilitarianism is an ethical theory that cares about consequences. So what you will see is, so utilitarianism applied to AI. A lot of the work there is around self-driving cars, because philosophers then have to look at what if something goes wrong, how do we make the car react? And a lot of the times, then philosophers will say, act to promote the best consequences. So don't kill the driver, kill the fewest number of people, promote good consequences. So that's what utilitarianism says. deontology is about duties. So this is the ethical theory that I think most people will be familiar with. It says that we have moral duties, and those should never be broken. So one area that this applies to is especially the UN and human rights. So they're taking a human rights-based approach to AI. And the idea is that you always have duties of human rights and you can never violate them. So that doesn't mean, this is regardless of the consequences. Even if violating these human rights would produce better consequences, you can't do it. So that's what deontology says. Virtue ethics is the most complex of the three. It was developed a long time ago by Aristotle and is built around developing yourself so that you can live what he called a flourishing life. And basically, it's about constantly educating yourself and acting in good conscience, essentially. And this one, we can talk about it in a minute, but has so far the least applicability to AI, but I'm working to change that.
Oh, okay. Sabrina, are you able to hear me?
Yes, I can hear you just fine, yeah.
Yeah. So in your paper, you mentioned ethics often takes second place to economics in the policymakers' decision process. Is this entire thing avoidable, or is it utopian to assume that it could be otherwise? As a researcher in this field, what is your view?
I think the two don't have to be incompatible at all. We often have this capitalist mindset that regulation can hinder economic progress and innovation, but that absolutely doesn't have to be the case. So going back to Aristotle and the idea of virtue ethics, granted Aristotle had no idea about computers, but he thought that you had to create an environment suitable for flourishing. And that means that the economy, politics, philosophy all are inextricably linked. So I think if we create the right policy environment, we can encourage technological innovation that serves the needs of citizens and doesn't risk harm or damage to individuals. So while they often can be at odds with one another, I absolutely don't think they have to be. And one of the things that's indicative of this is the recent trend in kind of ethical or fair consumer goods, veganism, fair trade, and this is now spilling over to data. People want their companies to buy products from companies that are responsible with data and have fair AI practices. So no, I don't think that these two are incompatible, but it might take some work to get us there.
Okay. So Dr. Sabrina, continuing, would the tech industry practitioners' perspective be any different than the policymakers? And can you share some examples where the views of the policymaker and the industry practitioner actually varied?
That's a really good question. And there are some examples. So there's a famous example about Google just disagreeing with regulators about what counts as a human rights violation. And when GDPR came into power in the UK and Europe, a lot of companies said it would be bad for business and thought it would be burdensome, which is now not necessarily true. And some companies are saying it's actually been good for them. But I think the most interesting disagreements actually come from private companies and the general citizenry. A lot of times government policymakers are acting in response to citizen complaints. So like I mentioned earlier, things are developing and changing in this field so quickly and governments run so slowly that policymakers almost always seem to be playing catch up. So I think more often than not, it's the views of the citizen consumer that differ from the industry practitioner. And both public and private entities then have to adjust accordingly. So one of the examples of this is the recent public uproar over facial recognition technology at King's Cross. policymakers then had to respond, as did the private companies. So really, I think a lot of the change in this area and the disagreements come from the bottom down rather than, or bottom up rather than just top down.
Okay. So moving to automation. Now, since automation is a process, you have inputs, the process itself and outputs. How would this translate for a policymaker when he or she is thinking about addressing the issue of AI ethics?
I think the only thing you can do is take a holistic approach to ethics. Like I was talking about earlier, and the self-driving cars, you can't just think about the consequences of the outputs or the outputs. You have to think about every piece in the process and how that might affect citizens and their rights and their needs. So this includes the collection of data that goes into programming AI and the nature of the algorithms used. And it matters then who does the collecting and programming and interpreting of what comes out the other side. So I think policymakers have to keep this holistic process in mind. They can't just look at one aspect of it when trying to come up with good governance around AI.
And probably in the current scenario of the entire discourse around how governments are managing the COVID relief action,
yes.
This becomes all the more pertinent, isn't it?
Oh, you're so right. It's right now they're just in like post hoc. Well, how do we deal with what's already happened? But that's clearly not working. And I think you're right that that's a great example. AI is going to be a very similar situation.
In fact, probably for researchers like you, it sets off an entire plethora of possible research questions to answer that which style worked best and how did, the question of ethics and technology in a humanitarian solution, come into the context.
No, you're so right. And a lot of it then is about staying ahead of the curve, trying to predict what's happening next and what the next big challenge will be, which is difficult. Yeah. But I think, yeah, like I said, you can't just look at it piecemeal. That's my biggest, my soapbox when it comes to policy making and AI.
So, Sabrina, in your paper on ethics and AI, you had mentioned that virtue ethic occurs not as an isolated incident, but when one repeatedly does good and in good consciousness. So how does this aspect translate into an automated AI algorithm?
Oh, that is a really difficult question. I think we'd be tempted to say that machine learning can, like the answer's in machine learning rather, but I really don't want to say that. Machines can't be taught to be virtuous. And there's an interesting theory that maybe they can eventually, but we're not there. So I really think that the answer is that virtue ethics doesn't come around the algorithm. It's around the people doing the innovation, doing the programming, interpreting, using these products. There's a great philosopher at Edinburgh University called Shannon Valor, and she wrote a book called Technology and the Virtues. And so her main argument is we need to learn to live virtuously, wisely, and well, as she puts it, with technology. So I think it's really still on the humans. It's on the human side, the impetus, the ethics around virtue ethics and AI is still on the humans. The burden's on the humans and not around teaching machines to produce good consequences or follow certain rules.
In fact, I'll go on a tangent here. You were at Oxford and you mentioned this author who is at Edinburgh. How is it that most of the work that is happening on responsible AI as a subject is happening in the UK? Why is it? It's because that's a very common trend I am finding. Is that really the case?
No, that's such a good question, actually. And you're right. I hadn't really thought about it until you just mentioned it, but it's true. I think there are a couple reasons. One, the UK has quite a good and a close-knit community of philosophers, whereas like in the US, for example, where I'm from originally, the reason I came over here to study is because the community is much more tight-knit. we talk to each other a lot more, things like that. In the US, research is spread out and a little bit more disparate. The other thing is that the government here really seems to care about AI ethics. They have the Center for, Data, Ethics, and Innovation, the Turing Institutes here. So I think the government's really been a big supporter of this type of research here.
I see. Okay. So
There's some funding to be had as well, which is unfortunately one of the issues.
Okay. So going back to those three theory points that we were talking upon, which of those three elements seems to predominate today when it comes to the policymaker or the government's decision making about marrying technology and ethics?
For a long time, it has been consequentialism. That's kind of what started off the field of AI ethics, because all we cared about was, what is the machine doing? What are the consequences of using this machine, this technology? And like I said about self-driving cars, that was one that really kicked off the AI ethics debate, because there was a clear and present danger, life and death were involved. Now, philosophers, deontology has really started to creep in to the literature and to policymakers' considerations, because we talk more and more about red lines or duties, duties that the government has to citizens, duties that the corporation has to their consumers. So we talk more and more about kind of these red lines, the regulations that you're not allowed to break, and that helps to govern AI a bit. And then a couple of us are starting to think about virtue ethics. So hopefully we'll see an uptake in that thinking before too long.
In your experiences of working with governments and policymakers, which governments, say globally, maybe at a federal level or at a provincial level, are actively looking at ethical considerations when taking technology-related policy decisions? Are there any examples you could share on this?
Yeah, of course. So like I said earlier, the UK is doing a lot. Took on GDPR, established lots of funding in this area, established its own think tank essentially for this area. So I think the UK is one of the leaders and early adopters of AI and ethics. Singapore is also doing a lot. They set up an AI ethics committee with global thinkers, mostly from commercial corporations, to help them govern their kind of future of work program over the next 5 years. India actually has a really interesting and different approach. So they're focusing on governing AI for social good. So where they're looking at AI and ethics, they're looking at what AI can do for healthcare and education. So I think it's quite a different program to kind of the UK and Singapore, which are more holistic and what does AI ethics look like? Whereas India is like, what can we do that is good with AI? And then again, going back to the States, it's been a fairly laissez-faire system so far, because all of the major tech corporations are based there and they kind of got a hold in and kept regulations from happening. But California is trying to start to do some work around AI and ethics. So watch that space, I guess.
In fact, it's, one example, in fact, I'll add here is in Dubai, in the UAE, where Smart Dubai as an organization, government-backed organization, has come up to offer technology-related policy solutions. And they're doing a lot of work on that front as well. But it's interesting that you mentioned India, because I'm based in Mumbai, which is the financial capital of India. And here, since the last 2 months, we are a lot of citizens by choice. They are using a mobile app called Arogya Setu, which is essentially a COVID-related management app. And I am not a technology person per se, so I will not be able to say how many elements of AI have gone into it. But for a country like India, which was, traditionally not known for technology and policy, mechanisms, it is quite impressive to see the amount of features and real-time updates and the real-time simulations that happen in that app. in a country of 1.3 billion, and you have
Yeah.
all the information on your fingertip. So it's, you know, I mean, rich countries, typically one would say that they have smaller populations and more resources, and hence they can do more. But, you know, India is proving a case and example that despite being a relatively poorer country with a larger population, you can still do a whole lot of things with technology and do it in the right way, do it in the right manner, do it with the right intent. So it is definitely examples like that.
No, I think that that's a great example. You're right. India is it shows that if you target the resources in the right places, it really can make an impact. Going back to COVID, interestingly, so South Korea did really well with their tracing app, but then in the UK, there was a big criticism that it's kind of an invasion of privacy. So again, the citizens and the balance of kind of what happens and the regulations around AI seem to be dictating quite a bit, which is interesting as well. As well, what you mentioned, the UAE and Dubai, the rise of smart cities will also be an interesting case study to look at in terms of local governance, because as cities become smarter, local regulations are going to have to be in place. So even if the central government isn't looking at this problem, local governments will absolutely have to engage.
So here I have a follow-up question. Now, you mentioned examples of certain countries around the world who are doing some you know, work on this front. How did the industry in those places benefit as a result of their government stance?
So one thing that GDPR has done for European and UK countries is build this level of trust. I mentioned earlier about kind of the rise of ethical consumerism and how this is now spilling over to the data and AI sector. And I think a lot of companies have reported consumers saying they now have increased trust in the companies that they're buying for, and how that's actually really led to a positive uptake and positive PR essentially for the consumers. So going back to the question you asked me earlier about innovation versus regulation, I actually think that this is a really good example of how the two can really work in tandem.
Because I mean, where I'm coming from in this question, just to give you the backdrop, you know, when it ethical AI or responsible AI, fair AI, there is this entire debate of which comes first, the chicken and egg story. Is it that the government has to do something first to set the, you know, the road in place, or is it that the industry conducts itself in a certain manner that puts in place the responsible use of technology? So there was this debate I've been hearing a lot that, I mean, whose responsibility is it first? Is it the government's responsibility? Is the onus on the government to do the first thing? Or is the onus on the industry to show that this is what is required and hence make the policy accordingly? This is where I was coming from. What are your views on this?
I think, I mean, it's a hard question to answer, isn't it? I think the answer has to be in this idea of a symbiotic relationship between the two, that they can't be at odds with one another, as kind of our economy has set us up to be. Private corporations is where the money is, where the innovation's happening. But governments are the ones with the power to help shape those regulations. So I don't think at this point we're too far in to say who started it or what matters. What matters now is them working together to come up with the right principles to guide the development of new technology, so that we as humanity benefit. I think there are a lot of startups in this area as well, which is kind of indicative of the private sector being able to kind of drive it and push it. A lot of civil society organizations have gotten involved. So there's a lot going on in this space. And I think it's just a matter of having a conversation and people not, I think a lot of times, you know, if Google comes up with one set of AI principles and Microsoft comes up with another, well, which one do we use? And they're competing, and that's not the right attitude to have in this space right now. It has to be a symbiotic, mutual cooperation environment.
So, Dr. Sabrina, as a concluding question, can you share some examples of companies, corporations who are incorporating this type of thought process of ethical AI into their decision making?
Yeah.
The UK itself, UK seems to be doing a lot of work on this front.
Facebook just announced a board for its governance. The principal of my college at Oxford is on that board. Microsoft have an internal AI principles. Google very, very briefly had an AI ethics board. So I think the fact it's good to see the big corporations doing this because it means that smaller corporations will follow. But then in the UK, we have lots of startups that help companies monitor this type of thing, that are helping companies comply with GDPR, or helping companies look at kind of how their algorithms might be biased and how to root that out. So it's a big market. And I don't think there's one final solution, but there's a lot of interesting work going on in this space. And I don't know either what the right answer is. If it's a governance board, if it's a set of principles, if it's external monitors, I think it's likely to be a combination of all of them, but yet to be seen.
So, in fact, Dr. Sabrina, I did mention it was the concluding question, but with your permission, I'll ask one small question. We spoke about a lot of countries, a lot of companies, examples. One interesting thing that just struck me is that you did not mention anything about Israel. Israel is a country that has done a lot of work on new technologies, but what is the entire discourse of responsible technology or responsible AI when it comes to Israel?
Oh, that is a gap in my knowledge in a big way. No, I don't know much about the Israeli context, to be honest. Yeah, so I can't, no, I don't have much to say on that, but I will go and read up on it right now because I'm really interested to now form an opinion so that next time I'm asked this.
Well, Dr. Sabrina, it was great chatting with you. Thank you for all the insights and information you shared, and I wish you a good week ahead. Bye-bye.
Great, thank you very much.